In today's video, you're going to learn about generators in JavaScript. We're first going to talk about just a general description on what a generator is, and then I'm going to go through some helpful examples of using generators, how they work, and then also some use cases of them. Now, this video is not necessarily going to be an advanced guide on generators. There's definitely some more advanced things that you can do with generators when it comes to being like a library author and creating your own iterators and working with asynchronous programming and different things like that. But this video is going to be more of a beginner's guide on giving you the fundamentals of how generators work, okay? So a generator in JavaScript is a function that you can run, pause, and then re-enter. You can run the function, you can exit the function at some line of code, and then at some later point in time, you can re-enter that function, and that function will maintain its execution context and all the state within that function. But I'll talk about that in just a second, all right? Now, calling a generator function initially doesn't run the function right away. The initial calling of a generator function actually returns a generator object. And then on this generator object is going to have a few different properties, but the main one that we care about is the next property. And this is actually going to be a method in which when you call this method, that will then run your generator function. And then within your function, you can yield values from your function to effectively have those values be the return value of calling your next method of your generator object. Now, if none of that makes sense, I'm totally with you. That's how I felt the first time I kind of heard generators explained. So let's go through some examples that will hopefully kind of break this down and make things make quite a bit more sense here, okay? So the first example that we're going to look at is how you can use a generator to kind of just make sequential IDs within your program. So let's say you need some unique IDs and you just want to give some simple IDs from 0 until an infinite number. How could you generate those within JavaScript? Well, you could use a generator to do so. So let me comment this out first, and I'll cover the syntax and everything here in just a second. Right here is where I define or I create my generator function. And as you can see, it's not quite the same as making a typical function within JavaScript. And the main difference here is that behind the function keyword here, I have the star. So when you use function star, you are telling JavaScript that, hey, I actually want this to be a generator function right here, and I don't want it to just be a regular function. So when you use function and then you follow your function label by a star, that is telling JavaScript that this is going to be a generator function. But then following that, you create your generator just how you would create any typical function declaration with one kind of catch to it. So within this function declaration here, I name my function ID maker, and then I open up the body of my function with normal curly braces like I would with any function. And then within your function, you can have some logic. Now, an interesting thing with generators is that instead of using a return statement, which you can use a return statement, but I'll touch on that in just a second, you'll often see a yield statement used. And this can be thought of as a return statement. However, when you call this same generator function again, you are actually going to enter that function at your yield statement. Okay, so the way this is going to work is that when I yield from this function, it's going to yield this index after incrementing it by 1 here. And then when I call this function again, it's going to re-enter this function right at this yield statement. And then it's going to check this while loop condition again. It's going to yield index plus plus. It's going to re-enter at the yield statement. It's going to check the condition, and so on and so forth. So a yield statement within a generator, it's similar to a return statement, but wherever that yield occurs, that is where you're going to re-enter your generator. And we'll talk about some nuances with this in just a second. So for me to use my generator, I first need to call my generator function. So here on line 40, I call my generator function. Now, as I said in my description, this does not actually run the body of my function here the first time I call it. All it does is it creates a unique instance of my generator object. So the first call of this function, it just returns a generator object. So I declare const gen is equal to calling my ID maker, which returns my generator object. And as I say right here, if I call this function again here, and I call this gen2, well, this is going to create two unique instances of those generator objects. And both of those can thought of as being completely unique from each other. They are completely individual. They are decoupled from each other. Anytime I call gen.next, like I do here, it's not going to have any idea of when I call gen2.next. Those are going to be completely separate. So every time you call your generator initially, it's going to create a unique instance of a generator object. But on line 40 here, I call my ID maker initially, which returns a generator object. And then on that object, I have the .next method. In that .next method, it's going to basically yield the next value of the running of this function. And importantly here, it's going to return an object. So when I yield a value here, it's going to return an object. And on that object, it's going to have two properties. It's going to have a value property with the value that I return here. So in this case, the value property of the return object is going to be my index, but it's also going to have a done property. And that's just going to be a Boolean, true or false. And that done property represents, okay, is your generator function done yet? Like, have you completed the running of your generator function? And you'll know when you completed the running of your generator function when you hit a return statement. Because a return statement, similar with regular functions, that is the end of that function no matter what. So it's going to set that done property to true. So let me run this and show you what this actually looks like. And I'll kind of take you through this example and how this is working. So when I run this here, you can see that I return 4 different objects. And that is because I call gen.next 4 separate times here. So it's going to yield 4 different values. And just to kind of take you through this entire example, on line 40, I return my generator object. And then to actually run the body of this function, I need to call the .next method of that generator object. And I do that 4 separate times here on lines 43 through 46. And when you call the .next method, it is going to return an object. And that object is going to contain 2 properties, a value and a done property. The value property is going to be whatever value is returned or yielded by your generator function here. So in this case, it yields my index the first time it enters this while loop, which is going to be 0. And then that yield statement is where it's going to re-enter that function when I call the .next method again. So the first time I call generator.next, it's going to yield the value of 0, and it's going to just stop right here. And then when I call gen.next again, it's going to re-enter right at line 33 here. And then it's going to check, okay, well, is my while condition still true? Yes, it is, because I just passed true to my while condition. So it's going to re-enter the body of this function, and there we go again. It's going to hit this yield statement, and then it's going to return the value of 1 because it's going to increment my index, but done is going to be false because I haven't hit a return statement yet at this point. So done is still false. And then I'm going to come down to line 45 here. I'm going to call gen.next again. It's going to re-enter at this yield statement. It's going to check if this while loop is true. It is true. It's going to yield the value of 2. We're still not hitting a return statement, so we're going to have done is false, and then so on and so forth. Okay. Now, you can also pass arguments to your generator function. So let me show you an example of how this works after I comment out my first example here. So for passing arguments to these functions, you can actually pass them in when you call your .next method. So here on line 49, I initialize another generator function called passing args. And remember, generator functions are going to have the asterisk following the function declaration keyword. And then within the body of this function, I create a variable called I, and then I assign it to a yield statement, and then I yield the value of 1. And then on line 51, I yield my variable I. And then on line 52, I return all done. So in this example, we're going to see what happens when you hit a return statement and how you can pass arguments. And then on line 55 here, I call my passing args generator function. And remember, this does not run the body of my function. This returns a generator object. So gen is my generator object, and on that object, I can use the .next method to get different values of my generator function and to actually run my generator function. Now, as I said earlier, the first time I call this .next method, it is going to yield the first value that is yielded from my function. And it could also be the first value returned from my function if there are no yield statements. But here, I yield the value of 1. So, on line 57 here, this is going to return an object that contains the value of 1, and done is going to be false because I have not hit this return statement yet. But then on line 58 here, this is where we get into passing arguments. So when I call this .next method, I pass the value of 12. And what that's going to do here is I'm going to re-enter this generator function directly at my yield statement right here. And when I pass this value in to my gen.next, it's actually going to pass it in right to this yield statement. And this yield statement is going to effectively evaluate to the value that I pass in to my generator.next method. Which means that my variable I right here is actually going to be assigned to the value of 12 because that is what yield is going to evaluate to since I pass it as an argument to my .next method. I know that this is a little bit tricky. It took me a minute to wrap my head around what's going on here because it's a little bit different than just using regular functions. But as I said here on line 57, we are going to yield the first value of this generator function, which is going to be the value of 1. And then on line 58, when I call the .next method and I pass in the argument of 12, that's what this yield statement's going to evaluate to. We're going to return to this line right here, line 50, and then we're going to start running my function. 12 is going to get assigned to my variable I here. And then what I'm going to yield here on line 58 is going to be my next yield statement, which is the value I, which, if my logic is correct here, is going to be the value of 12. So if we run this here, we see that the first time I call generator.next and I console log that, I'm going to get the value of 1, and done is going to be false. Exactly what we expected. And then the second time I call it, I'm going to get the value of 12 here, and done is going to be false. Also what we expected, because I pass in 12 to my .next method, which is going to come to this line right here. That's what this yield statement's going to evaluate to. 12 is going to get assigned to I, and then I'm going to yield that on the next line. And then, as you can see, the next thing that happens in my function here is I return all done. So when I call my generator.next here again, what you're going to see is my value is going to be all done. So the value is going to be whatever you yield or whatever you return from your generator function. But since I hit a return statement, I have nothing else to do in the body of this function. So done is going to be true. So if I run this code again, you're going to see that the very final time I call this generator function, my value is all done here, which is what I return here. And then since I hit a return statement, my generator function is going to be completely finished. There's nothing else to do. So done is going to be set to true. Okay. Now for generator functions, I mainly write React code. That has been my professional career here the last 3 years, working as a full-time UI engineer is my title. And with that, I have never once wrote a generator function. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not useful or that I never would write them, but I just haven't in my day-to-day code really had a great use case in which the potential complexity of writing a generator function is worth it within my professional application that I work on. Now, that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't understand them or that they're not useful. I definitely think they can be. And they can be useful when you're using asynchronous functions. You could potentially pause a function until some promise resolves and then re-enter that function. If it sounds very similar to async await, it's because it is. And then you can also use them to generate sequential IDs like I talked about. They're used in kind of JavaScript libraries quite often. And then they can also be used to create iterators, which I will also create videos on in the future. Okay. So a generator function within JavaScript, you create this function by using the function declaration and then a star following the function keyword. And then you write just a normal body of your function here to where you give your function a label, and then you open up a pair of curly braces for the body of your function. And then within that function, you can yield different values. But if you want your function to be completely done running at some point, then you can also return values. And the first time you call your generator function, it's going to create a unique instance of a generator object. And on this object, you are going to have multiple properties, but the one that we probably care about most is the .next property. And the .next property is going to return an object. And on this object, it is going to have a value property. And this value property is going to be the next value that is either yielded or returned from your generator function. And on the returned object from the .next method, it is also going to have a done property. And that is going to tell you whether your generator is done running. Have you hit a return statement yet? If you have, done is going to be set to the Boolean true. If not, it's going to be set to the Boolean false. And then one key thing to keep in mind with generator functions is that when you yield a value, that is effectively going to pause your generator function. It's going to return whatever value that you yielded. But when you call the .next method again, that yield statement, that line of code is exactly where you're going to return to within your generator function. And occasionally it might be useful to pass a value to the .next method. And if you do that, then whatever yield statement that you're returning to within your generator function, that's what that is going to evaluate to. And then you can continue the running of that function until you hit your next yield statement. So hopefully this video gives you a good understanding of how generators work. I know this can be a little bit tricky of a subject, but I think that, once you play around with it a bit, you will gain a good understanding of how they work. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.